Welcome to our study of the Gospel according to Mark. This is a work of the Meadowview Church of Christ in Mesquite, Texas. And now, here is Mike Heisel with today's lesson.
Thank you for joining me today as we continue our study through the Gospel according to Mark. In a few moments, we're going to begin reading in Mark chapter 2, verse 23. And so please go ahead and open your Bibles to that passage. This is our first Bible study of 2021, and we all want this year to be a great year. And the most important thing to determine whether or not it's a good year or not is how we do spiritually in 2021. And the only way to be faithful spiritually and to succeed spiritually is to have a close relationship with the Lord. And you know, relationships require communication. We have to talk to God and we have to allow God to talk to us. Well, obviously the way that we talk to God is through prayer. And so we need to resolve in 2021 to spend more time in prayer. And of course the way that God talks to us is through His Word. And so in 2021 we need to resolve to spend a great deal of time in God's Word. And one of the good ways that we can do that is by our studying Mark's Gospel account together. All right, so let's begin reading Mark 2, verse 23, and we'll read through the end of the chapter. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as His disciples walked along, they began to pluck some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to Him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priest to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Now, something that we haven't done a whole lot of as we've been studying through Mark's Gospel account is to try to put all four of the Gospel accounts together and to show, chronologically speaking, when various events occurred. But if we were to do that, we would see that between the passage that we studied last week, that is Mark 2, verse 18 through 22, that is the controversy about fasting, and the passage that we're studying today, that is Mark 2:23 through the end of the chapter, between those two passages, another event occurred. And that other event is what is recorded for us in John chapter 5. Now, if you remember, at some point in our study of Mark's Gospel account, I made the comment that the most helpful Gospel account in setting an overall framework for the life of Christ, especially as it relates to His ministry, is John's Gospel account. Because the synoptic Gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, only refer to one Passover that Jesus and His disciples went to, and that is the final Passover. But through John's Gospel account, we learn that there were actually 4 Passovers that took place during Jesus' ministry. And in John chapter 5, we read what is probably the second of those Passover feasts. Now, it's not explicitly referred to as a Passover in John chapter 5. It's just referred to as a feast of the Jews, but the general consensus is that it probably was a Passover. But at any rate, between Mark chapter 2 and verse 22 and Mark chapter 2 and verse 23, the event of John chapter 5 occurred. That is, Jesus and His disciples went to Jerusalem for the second Passover of Jesus' ministry. And so we would date that then in the spring of AD 28. All right, so we've moved in then to AD 28 in Jesus' ministry. Now, reason I bring this up is because, I pointed out, I think it was last week, that beginning in Mark chapter 2, we see that there are these controversies in Jesus' ministry, criticisms that Jesus gets for various reasons. And so what we're going to see here at the end of Mark chapter 2 and at the beginning of Mark chapter 3, that Jesus is criticized for doing things on the Sabbath day. He's accused of breaking the Sabbath law. And actually, the event that, again, occurs between Mark 2:22 and Mark 2:23 in John chapter 5, when Jesus goes to Jerusalem for the Passover feast, Jesus gets criticized for healing on the Sabbath day. So if you were to look at John 5, you would see that, Jesus comes to Jerusalem, and near the sheep gate, there's this pool. And it's called the Pool of Bethesda. It's a pool that has 5 porches. And in these 5 porches, there's a number of disabled people and sick people. And there's this belief that whenever the water is stirred up, whenever anyone gets in that pool with the disturbed water, that the first person in will be healed. And so there's a man who's been crippled for 38 years. And Jesus heals this man. And because he healed the man on the Sabbath day, he's accused of breaking the Sabbath. And so, for instance, in John chapter 5, and at verse 16, we're told, "So because Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, the Jewish leaders began to persecute him. In his defense, Jesus said to them, 'My Father,'" now he's not talking about his adoptive father Joseph, he's talking about God the Father. "My Father is always at his work to this very day, and I too am working." You go back to the book of Genesis and you read that God created the world in 6 days and he rested the 7th day. He rested on the Sabbath day. That was the pattern for the Jews: work 6 days, rest on the 7th day, on the Sabbath day, what we would know as Saturday. You see that, for instance, Exodus chapter 20, verses, 7 through 11? Well, even though God on the 7th day ceased his work of creation, he didn't cease his work of maintaining and caring for his creation. Remember that the sun rises and the sun sets only because God allows the sun to rise and the sun to set. And so, even though God stopped creating on the 7th day, God caused there to be darkness and caused there to be light on the 7th day, which means that God was working on the 7th day. And so Jesus says, "My Heavenly Father is always working, even on the Sabbath day, and so I'm willing to work. I'm willing to perform a work of mercy and to heal a man who is crippled on the Sabbath day." Well, we're told in verse 18 of John 5, "For this very reason they tried all the more to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God." So now they seek to kill him not just for violating the Sabbath, but also for what they believed was blasphemy. But of course, Jesus was telling the truth. But, I bring that up just to show that Jesus is now being criticized for these supposed violations of the Sabbath day. And so it seems like that reputation of being a Sabbath breaker has followed Jesus after he's left Jerusalem and left the Passover feast and the Feast of Unleavened Bread in Jerusalem, and after he's gone back into Galilee. So the event here in Mark 2 takes place in Galilee. Right? So we read here, Mark 2, verse 23, so back to Mark 2, that one Sabbath Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. Now it's interesting that they are traveling through a field on the Sabbath day, because there were Jewish traditions against traveling on the Sabbath day. You remember in Acts chapter 1, and I believe this is the only place in the Bible that this tradition is referenced, but in Acts chapter 1 and verse 12 we're told, "Then the apostles returned to Jerusalem from the hill called the Mount of Olives," so this is after Jesus' ascension, "a Sabbath day's walk from the city." So the Mount of Olives was a Sabbath day's walk from the city of Jerusalem. Of course, the Mount of Olives was, there to the east of the Temple Mount. Well, a Sabbath day journey was 2,000 cubits. Now, this is not in the Old Testament. Again, this is a tradition. But a Sabbath day journey is 2,000 cubits. And a cubit was roughly the length from the tip of your middle finger to your elbow. So it's roughly 18 inches. So 2,000 cubits then would be 3,000 feet. So a Sabbath day journey was just over half of a mile for us, right? So Jesus here is traveling through a field on the Sabbath day, which typically Jews would not travel on the Sabbath day. So surely he's not going very far. It would just be around this town where he's staying, probably less than 2,000 cubits. But as they're traveling, they're going through a field, through a grain field, right? So we're going to notice in just a second, because this grain is relatively ripe. I mean, there are heads of grain on these stalks. So again, this is spring. This would be April, or this would be May. So this is just right after the Passover feast in John chapter 5. But anyway, they're going through this grain field, and you say, well, why are they trespassing going through a grain field? Well, oftentimes paths would go through fields. You remember how Jesus told the parable of the sower. And in the parable of the sower, he said, a sower went out to sow a seed, and as he sowed a seed, some seed fell along the path, because these paths would go through fields. So the disciples, as they're traveling then on this Sabbath day, and again, it would in all probability be this short distance, they're traveling through this field, they're on this path through the field, and the disciples, as they walked along, we're told that they began to pick some heads of grain and eat it. Now, we would wonder, what are they doing stealing grain from the owner of the field? But that wasn't the way that the Jews looked at it. It was actually a lawful thing, if you were traveling through someone's field and you were hungry, to eat a little bit. Consider, for instance, the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 23. Deuteronomy 23. Deuteronomy 23, we'll start in verse 24. Verse 25 will be our focus, but we'll look at verse 24 first. If you enter your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat all the grapes you want, but do not put any in your basket. If you enter your neighbor's grain field, you may pick kernels with your hands, but you must not put a sickle to their standing grain. So it was all right if you're traveling through your neighbor's grain field and you're hungry, you can pluck a couple and eat them, but you can't harvest. You can't put a sickle in and harvest your neighbor's grain. And this is the tradition behind, or this is the law, I should say, behind the book of Ruth. You remember when Ruth and Naomi returned back to Bethlehem? We're told, Ruth is going to help take care of Naomi. And in Ruth 2, verse 2, we're told, Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up some leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." And of course, Naomi says to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." Well, the background to that is this tradition that you could, get a little bit of your neighbor's grain for your hunger. So that's what the disciples are doing. Now, a detail that's not recorded in Mark's account is recorded in Luke's account, because this is an event that occurs in Matthew 12, the opening verses of Matthew 12, and Luke chapter 6, the opening verses of Luke 6. Remember, the only event outside of the last week of Jesus' life that's recorded in all four gospel accounts is the feeding of the 5,000. That's the only event before Jesus' last week that's in all four gospel accounts. But this event occurs then in three of the gospel accounts, the three synoptic gospel accounts, Matthew 12, Mark 2, and Luke chapter 6. But in Luke chapter 6, here's what we're told. Verse 1. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. So that's what you would do. You would pull off the head, and then you want to get the kernels out. So to get the kernels out, you'd rub them in your hands, and then you would eat these kernels. That's what the disciples were doing. And what they were doing was something that everybody viewed as being lawful if it was on a day other than the Sabbath day. Okay? But there's some Pharisees there. Verse 24 says, the Pharisees said to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Now, I find that interesting. In the King James Version, the word corn is used. I can't remember if it's used in all three of the accounts, but I know in Matthew's account, Jesus is described as going through the cornfields. And when I read about this, the disciples going through the cornfields in the King James Version, and then the Pharisees, pointing out that the disciples have done what's unlawful, I think of Hee Haw. You remember the old show Hee Haw from, I guess it started in, I don't think it started in the 60s, maybe it started in the late 60s, but definitely in the 70s and in the 80s. You would have that one scene in every episode where you would have, a picture of the corn, and, people would pop up out of the corn. And so what I picture whenever I read this text in the King James Version is Hee Haw. You got the Pharisees who are hiding in the corn, and all of a sudden they pop up because they're trying to catch Jesus and His disciples doing something that they can accuse them of, and so they pop up out of the corn and they say, look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? All right, so we have to ask the question, is it unlawful then to pluck heads of grain on the Sabbath? Well, let's go back and let's look at a few passages about the Sabbath. Right, so in Exodus chapter 20, beginning in verse 8, I think I said verse 7 before, but verse 8, Exodus 20 verse 8, we're told, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but He rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So you couldn't work on the Sabbath day. The question is, what constitutes work? Well, if we go over to Exodus chapter 34, we see that sowing and reaping is work that was prohibited on the Sabbath day. Exodus 34 verse 21 says, 6 days you shall labor, but on the seventh day you shall rest. Even during plowing season and harvest you must rest. But what the disciples did in plucking the heads of grain was not considered harvesting grain. Because remember, Deuteronomy 23:25, you couldn't put the sickle in and actually harvest the grain. You could pluck some heads of grain if you were passing through your neighbor's field and you were hungry, but you couldn't harvest the grain. So what the disciples did wasn't considered harvesting. But then we go over to Exodus chapter 35, and we see, for instance, verse 2, for 6 days work is to be done, but the seventh day shall be your holy day, a day of Sabbath rest to the Lord. Whoever does any work in it is to be put to death. So it's a serious sin to work on the Sabbath day. The death penalty is attached to working on the Sabbath day. Verse 3 says, do not light a fire in any of your dwellings on the Sabbath day. So lighting a fire was considered work. And in fact, in Numbers chapter 15, we actually find someone violating the Sabbath. How do they violate the Sabbath? Well, they're gathering sticks. Why would they be gathering sticks? No doubt to make a fire. And that person is stoned to death for violating the Sabbath. But why would you build a fire on the Sabbath day? Well, one of the reasons you'd build a fire on the Sabbath day is so that you could prepare food. And so preparing food, it's at least implicitly, is forbidden in this passage on the Sabbath day. That's cooking your food is forbidden on the Sabbath day. And if we go back to Exodus chapter 16, the passage about manna, we see in this passage, let me say, this is before the Sabbath law actually was given Israel. The Sabbath law wasn't formally given until they got to Mount Sinai. And Exodus 16 is 3 chapters before they get to Sinai. They get to Sinai in chapter 19, and then the Sabbath law is given in Exodus chapter 20. But in Exodus 16, the Israelites are going through the desert, and, of course, they don't have any food. So, there's a crisis. You've got, 603,550 men, 20 years old and above, plus women, plus children. And, how are you going to feed them? And so, of course, we know that God provides manna for them. In Psalm 78, manna is described as angels' food. So, they didn't have angel food cake, but they did have angel food, this food that was miraculously supplied for them. And every morning they were to go out and gather this manna. Whenever the dew lifted, every morning there was the manna. And so they were to go out every morning and gather enough for that day. They weren't to save any over, or it would breed worms. They were to go out every day. Maybe this is in part the background to Jesus teaching us to pray, give us this day our daily bread. But at any rate, in Exodus chapter 16, here's what's said. Exodus 16, we'll start in verse 21. Each morning everyone gathered as much as they needed, as much manna as they needed. And when the sun grew hot, it melted away. On the 6th day, that is on what we would call Friday, they gathered twice as much, 2 omers for each person, and the leaders of the community came and reported to Moses. He said to them, "This is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow, that is the 7th day, what we would call Saturday, what would be the Sabbath day, tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake whatever you want to bake and boil what you want to boil, save whatever is left and keep it until the morning." So they saved it until the morning as Moses commanded, and it did not stink or get maggots in it. So you see, with the manna, no manna was supplied from God on the Sabbath day. They were to gather twice as much on Friday, on the 6th day, and they were to prepare it all on the 6th day so that it would be ready for them to eat on the 7th day. So they weren't to gather food and they weren't to prepare food on the Sabbath day. So that's what the Old Testament says then about preparing food on the Sabbath day. Now, there were Jewish traditions that grew up, and a part of the Jewish traditions involved defining what was meant in the Old Testament laws. And these are written down for us in a book that's called the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah was written in about 8200. So, we're talking 170 years after Jesus' death, the Mishnah is written down. But what was written down in the Mishnah in 8200 were traditions that go back even before the time of Jesus. So these are ancient traditions. And one of the sections of the Mishnah is called Shabbat, Sabbath. And it involves instructions concerning how to keep the Sabbath. And it traditionally defines what the Pharisees considered to be working on the Sabbath day. And so in Shabbat 7, the second section of Shabbat 7, we have a definition of what was traditionally considered work on the Sabbath day. Here's what it says. The main classes of work are 40 save one: sowing, plowing, reaping, binding sheaves, threshing, winnowing, cleansing crops, grinding, sifting, kneading, baking, shearing wool, washing or beating or dyeing it, spinning, weaving, making 2 loops, weaving 2 threads, separating 2 threads, tying a knot, loosening a knot, sewing 2 stitches, tearing in order to sew 2 stitches, hunting a gazelle, slaughtering or flaying or salting it or curing its skin, scraping it or cutting it up, writing 2 letters, erasing in order to write 2 letters, building, pulling down, putting out a fire, lighting a fire, striking with a hammer, or taking out aught from one domain into another. These are the main classes of work, 40 save one. So we see that traditionally at least, the Pharisees would consider the disciples as having violated the Sabbath law. Well, what did Jesus say in reply to this accusation that the disciples have done wrong? Well, verse 25 of Mark 2, Jesus says to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priest to eat. And he also gave some to his companions." So, what Jesus does is he brings up an example where David, in a time of necessity, did what was technically unlawful in order to have his appetite satisfied. Right? So Jesus says to the Pharisees, "Have you never read?" Now, that would be a passive, aggressive put down of the Pharisees. They prided themselves in knowing the Old Testament backwards and forwards. The passage that Jesus refers to when he says, "Have you never read?" is 1 Samuel chapter 21. So we might as well just turn back to 1 Samuel 21 and talk about it for just a minute. 1 Samuel 21, I'll start reading in verse 1. We're told David went to Nob. Now, so it seems like, 1 Samuel 4, the tabernacle is at Shiloh. But after the Philistines defeat the Israelites in battle and steal the Ark of the Covenant, it seems they went to Shiloh and attacked the town of Shiloh. And so the tabernacle, without the ark that is, was moved to the town of Nob. All right, so it seems like here the tabernacle is in Nob. So David went to Nob to Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech trembled when he met him. Now remember, David is fleeing from Saul at this point in time, so David is not going to be honest with Ahimelech. So Ahimelech trembled when he met him and asked, "Why are you alone? Why is no one with you?" David answered Ahimelech the priest, "The king sent me on a mission and said to me, 'No one is to know anything about the mission I'm sending you on. As for my men, I've told them to meet me at a certain place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever you can find.' But the priest answered David, 'I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here, provided the men have kept themselves from women.' David replied, 'Indeed, women have been kept from us as usual whenever I set out. The men's bodies are holy, even on missions that are not holy. How much more so today?' So the priest gave him the consecrated bread, since there was no bread there except the bread of the presence that had been removed from before the Lord and replaced by the hot bread on the day it was taken away." So what is this bread of the presence? Well, remember, in the tabernacle, you got these 2 rooms, and we talked about that a little bit last week. You've got the holy place, and then the innermost room is the most holy place. Now, we said last week in the most holy place, there's only one piece of furniture, that is the Ark of the Covenant, with the mercy seat on top and the cherubim with their wings facing one another, and God's presence would be manifested by the glory cloud, over the mercy seat. Now, of course, at this particular point in time, however, the Ark of the Covenant is not in the most holy place because the Philistines have stolen it, and it's being kept in Kiriath Jearim. But that's a story for another day. But in the first room of the tabernacle, the holy place, there were 3 pieces of furniture. You had the closest to the curtain. So the innermost piece of furniture would be the altar of incense. And then let me get my directions straight, on the south side of the tabernacle, you would have the menorah. And on the north side of the tabernacle, you would have the table of showbread. And on the table of showbread, we're told, for instance, Exodus chapter 25, verse 30, that there were to be 12 loaves there. And the 12 loaves represented the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, we're told an important detail that's relevant to the story about those loaves in Leviticus chapter 24. So I invite you to turn with me to Leviticus chapter 24. And in Leviticus 24 and verse 5, here's what we're told about those loaves. We're told, take the finest flour and bake 12 loaves of bread using 2/10 of an ephah for each loaf. So these are large loaves, okay? Arrange them in 2 stacks, 6 in each stack on the table of pure gold before the Lord. That is the table of showbread. By each stack, put some pure incense as a memorial portion to represent the bread and to be a food offering presented to the Lord. This bread is to be set out before the Lord regularly, Sabbath after Sabbath, on behalf of the Israelites as a lasting covenant. Now note this is important. It belongs to Aaron and his sons, who are to eat it in the sanctuary area because it is a most holy part of their perpetual share of the food offering presented to the Lord. All right, so this bread is replaced every Sabbath day with fresh bread, and the priests are to eat it, and only the priests are allowed to eat it. No one aside from a priest is allowed to eat it. But here, David comes to the tabernacle, and David is hungry because, he's fled in haste. He's running from Saul. Now he tells the priest he's on a mission from Saul, an urgent mission, but he's fled in haste. Saul had sent the men to kill him in chapter 19, so he's run from his home, and he's fled in haste, so he's hungry. And so it seems like this is a Sabbath day because the priests haven't eaten the bread yet. And there are over 80 priests there who would eat the bread. So it seems like this is a Sabbath day. But, in a time of necessity, the priest decided to set aside this ceremonial aspect of the law to provide for David's needs, and he gave David the loaves of bread. Now, seemingly, the Pharisees believed that was legitimate, to set aside this ceremonial aspect of the law in order to provide for the necessities of David. And so Jesus' argument is, the disciples have been busy in ministering to me. They haven't had enough time to get a meal. They're hungry now because they've been so busy in ministering to me. So it's legitimate for them, while we're traveling in serving me, traveling through this grain field, it's legitimate for them then to pluck these heads of grain and to eat it. So that's Jesus' overall argument. Now, I'm going to make a comment at the end of the video about Abiathar being described as the high priest. I'm going to pass over that now because I do want to point out, and I haven't done this a whole lot, but I think that it's significant here to allow the different accounts to amplify one another. And there are some details given in Matthew's account of this that's not given in Mark, right? So Mark just goes from Jesus bringing up this example of David, to kind of the conclusion. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, so the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, right? But I want us to notice a little bit more of Jesus' argumentation that is described in Matthew's account. So turn back to Matthew 12. Matthew chapter 12. Matthew 12. So in Matthew's account, which is described in verses 1 to 8, in Matthew's account, Jesus talking about David eating the showbread is described in verses 3 and 4. But then in verse 5, Jesus goes on to say, he follows up that argument from the life of David with this, verse 5 of Matthew 12. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on the Sabbath, on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? So, you go back and you read the instructions concerning priestly duties, and the priests, they had to work on the Sabbath. Everybody else was to rest, but the priests were to work on the Sabbath. Well, what would they do on the Sabbath? They would have to light the lamps on the menorah on the Sabbath. They would have to burn incense on the Sabbath day. They would have to bake the loaves of the showbread on the Sabbath day and replace the loaves of the showbread on the Sabbath day. There were special Sabbath day sacrifices that they were to offer. And of course, there was the regular daily burnt offering that they were to offer in the morning and in the evening. And so the priests, in their holy work, they worked on the Sabbath day, but they were innocent. Because whenever the law said, rest on the Sabbath day, don't do any work, whenever the law said that, it obviously wasn't talking to the priest, because it went on to command the priest to work. And Jesus follows that up with this statement in verse 6. I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. Now, I didn't check this before recording this class. I should have, but it just slipped my mind. I think that the King James Version says, someone greater than the temple is here. And obviously the translators had in mind Jesus. But the Greek text won't allow that translation. The word that's translated greater here is meizon in the Greek. And that word, there was a masculine form of it. Had Jesus intended to say someone greater than the temple is here, he could have used a masculine or a feminine form. But he didn't. He used a neuter form. So the NIV is right in saying something greater than the temple is here. The point is, the priests work on the Sabbath day ministering in the temple. But Jesus says something greater than the temple is here. Something greater than temple service is here. Serving the Messiah is here. These disciples are involved in serving the Messiah. They're involved in serving me. You see, God's presence was manifested in the temple, in the glory cloud, but literally in the person of Jesus, you have God in flesh. John 1:14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We beheld His glory, the glories of the only begotten of the Father. So, if the priests were allowed to serve in the temple, much more on the Sabbath day, much more Jesus' disciples allowed to serve on the Sabbath day. And if the priests in the temple are allowed to bake showbread and exchange showbread and eat old showbread on the Sabbath day, certainly Jesus' disciples, who are heavenly involved in a greater service than temple service, they're allowed to pluck heads of grain and eat them on the Sabbath day. So that's Jesus' argument here. Now, something else that Matthew's account tells us that Mark's account doesn't is verse 7. In verse 7, Jesus says, if you had known what these words mean. Now he's going to quote Hosea 6:6. Now again, this is a slap in the face of the Pharisees who prided themselves in knowing the law. But he says, if you had known what these words mean, quote, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. You see, in the time of Hosea, the people, and by the way, Amos and Isaiah are contemporary prophets of Hosea. And you see the same thing condemned in Amos 5 and also in Isaiah 1. But I haven't told you what that thing that's condemned is. In those days, the people were wicked. Morally, they were absolutely wicked. They were taking advantage of one another. I mean, injustice abounded. People were killing, in order to steal other people's possessions. Just injustice everywhere. But, boy, the temple service was rocking along. People were going for the feasts. Sacrifices were being offered. And the point that Hosea makes is God desires mercy rather than sacrifice. You see, it's not right to take God's word and hammer it down flat where you think that every commandment is equally important. That's not the case. Jesus said, Matthew 23:23, that there are weightier matters in the law. He said, you're so circumspect about tithing, but you pass over the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. He said, these you ought to have done and not to leave the others undone. You see, justice, mercy, and faithfulness is more important than tithing. Tithing is important. Jesus said to the Jews, now, we're not bound by the tithe today in the New Testament period, but to the Jews he says, you ought to tithe, don't overlook tithing, but the weightier matters of the law you're overlooking. You need to practice justice, mercy, and faithfulness. And that's the point in Hosea 6:6. God desires mercy and not sacrifice. Showing mercy is more important than keeping ritual. And so these Pharisees should show mercy to the disciples who are busy serving busy in a service greater than the service of the temple. They ought to have mercy on the disciples and not condemn them for plucking heads of grain to eat them so that they can feed their bodies so they can continue in this service that's greater than the temple on the Sabbath day. Now, I threw a lot of words out there, and the bad thing is I'm looking to a camera, so I'm not even sure if that made sense. But anyway, if it didn't make sense, call me and I'll try to explain it in words that make sense. This is one of the passages that I sure wish I could teach, in front of actual faces. That is not merely looking at my face. All right, so back to Mark chapter 2. Back to Mark chapter 2, and let's look at verse 27. Oh, and I'm going to go over a little bit in this video. Verse 27 says, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." And I mean, that's just self-explanatory. God did not create the Sabbath so that man would have a ritual to keep. God created the Sabbath to benefit man. Now, not everybody was under the Sabbath, just the Jews. So that's important. The Sabbath, you see this, for instance, in Exodus chapter 31. The Sabbath was a sign, a covenant sign between God and Israel. It was a sign that Israel was in covenant to God and that God had brought Israel out of their harsh slavery to the Egyptians and given them rest. And so they were to rest on the Sabbath day as this sign that God had taken the Israelites to be His own people and that He had given them rest from slavery, right? So the Sabbath was a sign of God's mercy to man. It was a blessing to man. So the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And he goes on to say, verse 28, "So," now this is an incredible statement, "so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Now, who owned the Sabbath? Whose Sabbath was the seventh day? Well, we go back to the Old Testament and we see in Exodus chapter 20, and at verse, let's see. Oh, verse 10. Excuse me. Blanked out there for a second. Exodus 20, verse 10. "But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God." So the Sabbath was something that the Israelites would keep to the Lord, in honor of the Lord. In Exodus chapter 31, and at verse 13, we're told, "Say to the Israelites, you must," now God is speaking. Well, let me read verses 12 and 13 because this adds to it. "Then the Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, you must observe my Sabbaths." So the Sabbath belonged to the Lord, and the Sabbath was to be kept to the Lord. So when Jesus says the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath, obviously Jesus is identifying Himself as the Son of Man, and we've already talked about the background of that is Daniel chapter 7 verses 13 and 14. Right? It's not just saying that Jesus is a man, but it's that Jesus is this exalted, glorified man who has the right to rule over all creation, who's given this kingdom, this everlasting kingdom in Daniel 7 verses 13 and 14. So Jesus is the Son of Man, but in saying that Jesus, the Son of Man, is Lord of the Sabbath, Jesus is identifying Himself as God. Because in the Old Testament, Yahweh is the Lord of the Sabbath. So this is a very, very powerful passage. Jesus is identifying Himself as Yahweh, and Jesus is saying that He has authority over the Sabbath. In other words, the Pharisees aren't the ones who get to determine what's lawful and what's not lawful on the Sabbath day. The Sabbath isn't their Sabbath. The Sabbath rather is Jesus' Sabbath, and Jesus is the one who gets to determine what's lawful and what's not lawful on the Sabbath day. And by the way, Jesus, the Lord of the Sabbath, whenever He died on the cross, did away with the Sabbath. We're not bound by the Sabbath today. Ephesians 2:15 says that He abolished in Himself the ordinances, the commandments and the ordinances of the law. And so now consequently, Colossians chapter 2 says this. Colossians chapter 2 and verse 16. Therefore do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, that is, whether or not you keep the dietary laws of Leviticus 11, or with regard to a religious festival, that is, whether or not we keep the pilgrim festivals of Deuteronomy 16:16, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. These are a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. And so Jesus, the Lord of the Sabbath, did away with the Sabbath whenever He died on the cross. All right, so we're 45 minutes. I got to conclude this thing. But before we do, I have to point out something that is often brought up by critics of the Bible to try to show that there's a contradiction in the Bible. So remember, we saw in verse 26 of Mark 2, in the days of Abiathar the high priest, David entered the house of God and ate consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priest to eat, and he gave also some to his companions. So here we're told that this happened when Abiathar was the high priest. But do you remember when we read in 1 Samuel 21, verse 1, it didn't say that Abiathar was the high priest. Rather, it said in 1 Samuel 21, verse 1, David went to Nob to Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech is the high priest. So people point out, well, there's a contradiction. 1 Samuel 21 says Ahimelech is the high priest. Mark chapter 2 and verse 26, Jesus said that Abiathar was the high priest. So is this a contradiction? Well, there are ways to look at it that keep it from being a contradiction. I mean, here's just a couple of thoughts. Well, let me say something about Abiathar. Who is Abiathar? Because I haven't explained that. Abiathar actually is Ahimelech's son. And in fact, in the next chapter of 1 Samuel, that is 1 Samuel 22, Saul will end up commanding Doeg, the Edomite, to kill Ahimelech and the other priests who are there in Nob because of what Ahimelech did for David. Because Ahimelech gave some of the showbread to David and inquired of the Lord for David. And so Doeg will kill the priests. But at that particular point in time, 1 Samuel 22 and verse 20 says, But one son of Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled to join David. Now, this Abiathar will become a high priest under David, but he was the son of Ahimelech. So is there a contradiction here? Well, no, not necessarily. Here's a couple of ways to look at it. The first is this. By the time of Jesus, everyone in the high priest's family was referred to as a high priest. Okay? The Greek word for priest is hierus. The Greek word for high priest is archierus. And by the time of Jesus, everybody in the priest's family wasn't just referred to as hierus, but they were referred to as archierus. They weren't just referred to as priests, they were referred to as high priest. And you can see examples of this, for instance, in Josephus. And I won't give you the references, but if you want them, I'll give them to you. The term high priest is used not just for the one who technically was the high priest, but for everyone in the high priest family by the time of the first century. So, on that account, it's perfectly legitimate. Abiathar was living at that time, and Abiathar was high priest by the definition of terms in Jesus' day. So that's one way to look at it. A second way to look at it is to pay careful attention to the construction. And I don't want to get too technical, but the particular construction, whenever the NIV says, in the days of Abiathar the high priest, well, I'll just say it's the Greek preposition epi Abiathar archiereos. So that's what's translated in the days of Abiathar the high priest. And that particular construction, epi with a noun in the genitive case, is used to describe a place in Scripture elsewhere in Mark's Gospel account. Now, please don't let me lose you with the technicality. I just said that to make the point, but I hope I don't lose you with that. But look, for instance, at Mark chapter 12. Mark chapter 12. And in Mark 12 and verse 26, Jesus is arguing with the Sadducees over over resurrection. And in Mark 12 verse 26, we're told, "Now about the dead rising, have you not read," now note this, "have you not read in the book of Moses in the account of the burning bush, how God said to him, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." All right, so in the book of Moses there, the passage in the book of Moses is described here as the account of the burning bush. Now in the Greek, it's just this, it's epi, that same preposition, to batu. The term for bush is batu here. So in the account of the bush. Well, that is the same construction that we find here in Mark 2 verse 26. So I would say that this could legitimately be rendered in Mark 2 verse 26, in the account of Abiathar the high priest, he entered into the house of God and ate the consecrated bread. In other words, the passage in 1 Samuel is identified as the account of Abiathar the high priest in the same way that the passage in the book of Moses in Mark 12 is identified as the account of the bush. Now, why would it be referred to as the account of Abiathar the high priest and not the account of Ahimelech the high priest? It's because Abiathar the son actually became more prominent, because he's the one who fled to David with the ephod. He's the one who becomes high priest more prominently for longer under David. And so it would be appropriate to refer to that passage as the account of Abiathar the high priest. And so when we understand it in that way, it's not a contradiction with 1 Samuel 21 at all. So I would say either one of those options, understanding either that high priest was a term used for anyone in the high priest family in the first century, or understanding that by the Greek construction this means in the account of Abiathar the high priest, either one of those keeps Mark 2 from being a contradiction with 1 Samuel 21. Well, again, if that was too technical at points, feel free to contact me, and I'll be glad to try to explain that in a little bit more understandable fashion. Well, I've gone 12 minutes over. I apologize. We've got to call it quits here. So God bless you, and look forward to studying with you next week.
We thank you for taking the time to worship with us and to study a portion of God's Word. We pray that this has been an edifying experience and that you would join us again. Now, if at any point during the lesson you had some questions, please feel free to email us at mhisal@meadowview.org. The email is both on the screen and in the description below. It is our goal to answer every Bible question with a Bible answer, to speak where the Bible speaks, and to be silent where it is silent. God bless you. We love you.